At the center of the gathering, Thomas Whitaker stood, his posture impeccably diplomatic, his dark eyes scanning the room with the precision of a predator. Abigail Whitaker, his wife, was at his side, her ethereal grace softening the harshness of their surroundings. She wore a pale blue gown that flowed like water, a stark contrast to the rigid uniforms of the Empire's officers. Her laughter, genuine and warm, was a fragile ember in a room filled with cold calculation. "Do you think they believe their own lies?" Abigail whispered, her voice just loud enough for Thomas to hear. "They don't have to believe them," Thomas replied, his tone neutral. "They just have to make us play along." A towering alien with emerald skin and elongated limbs approached them, his face an unreadable mask. Commander Tyrak Valen, the architect of countless battles against humanity, offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ambassador Whitaker," Valen said, his deep voice resonating like distant thunder, "and the lovely Abigail. Your presence here is a symbol of hope." Thomas inclined his head, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. "Hope is a rare commodity these days, Commander. It's good to see the Empire values it." Valen chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Indeed. Let us raise a toast to hope." Then a server appeared, carrying a tray of glasses filled with a shimmering golden liquid. As the room turned to focus on the toast, Thomas felt a prickle at the back of his neck, an instinct honed from years of combat. Abigail noticed it too, her hand brushing his in a subtle gesture of reassurance. "To peace," Valen declared, raising his glass. "To peace," the room echoed, though the word felt hollow in the charged air. As Thomas sipped the drink, his sharp eyes caught movement at the edges of the hall. Guards, armed and alert, were repositioning themselves. He set his glass down, the taste suddenly metallic and bitter. "Abigail," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Something's wrong." Before she could respond, the hall erupted into chaos. The chandeliers dimmed, replaced by the harsh red glow of emergency lights. Empire soldiers poured in from every entrance, their weapons aimed at the delegates. Screams and shouts filled the room as guests scrambled for cover. "Ambassador Whitaker," Valen's voice boomed above the din, calm and commanding. "You and your wife are under arrest for crimes against the Empire." Thomas pulled Abigail behind him, his mind racing. "What are you talking about, Valen? This is a peace summit." Valen's expression hardened. "Peace? No! This is justice." Before Thomas could act, an electrified net shot out from one of the guards, entangling him. The current surged through his body, sending him to his knees. Abigail screamed, her voice piercing through the chaos as she tried to reach him, but two soldiers grabbed her, dragging her away. "Leave her alone," Thomas roared, struggling against the net as his muscles convulsed. The locket around Abigail's neck, a gift from him on their wedding day, glinted in the red light as she fought against her captors. Valen stepped forward, his towering frame casting a shadow over Thomas. "You should have stayed on Earth, Whitaker. Your idealism has cost you dearly." Thomas's vision blurred, but he forced himself to focus on Abigail. "Don't touch her," he growled, each word a struggle. Valen sneered. "Touch her? No. But she will serve as a message." Without another word, he nodded to one of the soldiers. A blade flashed, its edge catching the dim light, and Abigail's struggle ceased as it plunged into her chest. Her eyes widened in shock, her lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came. She collapsed to the ground, her lifeless body crumpling like a discarded doll. "No!" Thomas's scream tore through the air, raw and primal, but his body refused to obey his will. He could only watch as the love of his life lay motionless, the locket slipping from her neck and landing beside her. Valen crouched, picking up the locket with a cruel smile. A keepsake, ambassador, to remember her by. Thomas's vision darkened, but not before he caught sight of a figure in the shadows, a human, cloaked and armed, moving with purpose. A single word reached his ears before unconsciousness claimed him. Baba Yaga. When Thomas awoke, he was alone in a cold, damp cell, his wrists bound and his body aching from the residual effects of the electric net. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the ship's engines. He stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying the events over and over, each memory sharpening his resolve. They had taken everything from him, and they would pay. Thomas, a voice broke the silence. He didn't look up. Tony Harlow, a wiry man with sharp eyes that rarely missed anything, stood in the doorway. The dim light glinted off the augmented lenses embedded in his temples, a relic from his time in Earth's cyber core. "We decrypted the intel you stole from their outpost. You should see this." Thomas's grip on the locket tightened before he slid it into his pocket and followed Tony into the adjoining room. The bunker's command center was a chaotic tangle of screens, wires, and hastily assembled terminals. Ethan Blaze, Carter leaned against a console, cleaning a high-powered rifle with practiced precision. His rugged features were marked by scars that told stories he rarely shared, but his eyes lit up when he saw Thomas. "Good to see you up, Whitaker," Blaze said, his tone gruff but not unkind. "We were starting to think you'd given up." Thomas ignored the comment, his eyes locking onto the largest screen where a map of the galaxy pulsed with red markers. Tony tapped a few keys, zooming in on a region dominated by Empire-controlled territories. "This," Tony began, "is the Eclipse, Valen's flagship. It's currently stationed here, on the edge of the Navari Nebula." Thomas stared at the blinking, his jaw tightening. "What's the security profile?" Tony smirked, though there was no humor in it. "Heavy, automated turrets, a fleet of interceptors, and a garrison of at least 1,000 soldiers. It's practically a floating fortress." Blaze snorted. "In other words, impossible to breach." Thomas's voice was ice. "Nothing is impossible." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Tony exchanged a glance with Blaze before continuing. "There's more. The data we recovered suggests the Eclipse isn't just a military asset. It's a hub for something darker. Weapons testing, biogenetic experiments, things they've been keeping off the books. Whatever they're planning, it's big." Thomas nodded, his mind already racing through strategies. "We hit the Eclipse. We take Valen, and we cripple their operations." Blaze let out a low whistle. "You're serious." "Deadly." The quiet conviction in Thomas's voice silenced any objections. Blaze sighed, running a hand through his cropped hair. "Fine, but if we're doing this, we do it smart. No running and guns blazing." Thomas glanced at him, a faint glimmer of respect in his otherwise cold gaze. "Agreed. We'll need to plan every step. No room for error." For hours they worked, poring over schematics, reviewing troop movements, and devising contingencies. Thomas's focus was relentless, his tactical mind honed by years of experience. Yet beneath the surface, there was a storm, a seething rage that threatened to consume him. As the team finalized their preparations, Tony leaned back in his chair, watching Thomas carefully. "You know," he said, his tone cautious, "this isn't just about Valen or the Empire. This is about her." Thomas's eyes flickered to him, cold and unyielding. "Everything I do is for her." Tony hesitated, then nodded. "Just don't lose yourself in the process." Blaze chuckled darkly. "Too late for that. Baba Yaga's back." The nickname hung in the air, a reminder of the man Thomas used to be, the ghost that haunted his enemies, the myth that terrified even the bravest soldiers. Thomas didn't respond, his expression unreadable as he turned back to the plans. When the time came, the team gathered in the hangar, a dimly lit cavern filled with stolen Empire tech and scavenged gear. Tony checked the uplink on his wrist console, while Blaze loaded the last of the explosives onto their ship. Thomas stood at the center, his presence commanding, his silence more powerful than any rallying cry. "This is it," Tony said, his voice steady. "We breach their defenses, plant the charges, and take out Valen. In and out before they know what hit them. Blaze smirked, his rifle slung across his back. Piece of cake. Thomas's gaze swept over them, his voice cutting through the tension. No mistakes. No hesitation. We don't stop until the job is done. As they boarded the ship, Thomas paused at the ramp, his hand brushing against the locket in his pocket. He closed his eyes for a moment, the memory of Abigail's smile flashing through his mind. Then he stepped inside, his resolve unshakable. The journey to the eclipse was tense, the silence broken only by the hum of the ship's engines and the occasional status update from Tony. When the massive silhouette of the Empire's flagship loomed into view, Blaze let out a low whistle. Hell of a target. Thomas didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the ship, his expression a mask of determination. As the vessel's automated defenses came online, Tony began a flurry of commands, hacking into the system with practiced ease. Shield generators disabled, Tony announced. We've got a window, but it's tight. Thomas nodded. Then let's move. As they breached the eclipse's perimeter and slipped into the shadows of its sprawling corridors, Thomas's mind was a razor's edge, every sense attuned to the mission. The team worked in perfect synchronization, each movement precise and calculated. When they reached the heart of the ship, Thomas paused, his hand resting on the detonator strapped to his chest. The weight of what they were about to do settled over him, but it was not hesitation he felt. It was purpose. This is for her, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Blaze glanced at him, his expression unreadable, then nodded. For her. As the first charge was set, a faint alarm echoed through the ship, growing louder with each passing second. The Empire would know they were here soon. But Thomas didn't flinch. He was already moving, his mind focused on the next step, the next target. Behind him, Tony and Blaze followed, their loyalty unspoken but unwavering. Together, they were a force of nature, a storm that would not be stopped. And as the eclipse trembled under the first explosion, Thomas knew this was only the beginning. The halls of the eclipse reverberated with the echoes of distant explosions. Alarms blared in unison with the synchronized stomping of boots as Empire soldiers scrambled to respond to the unseen threat. Thomas Whitaker moved with precision through the ship's labyrinthine corridors, his dark silhouette blending seamlessly into the shadows. The mission had barely begun, and already the tension was palpable. Behind him, Tony Harlow monitored their progress on a handheld console, his fingers flying across the interface as he redirected power surges and manipulated the ship's surveillance grid. Blaze Carter brought up the rear, his rifle sweeping in controlled arcs, ready for any sign of movement. The air between them was charged with unspoken understanding. Every step, every breath was calculated. East corridor clear, Tony whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant cacophony. Security nodes disabled up to the next junction. We've got 5 minutes before the system reboots. Plenty of time, Blaze muttered, adjusting the strap on his rifle. Thomas glanced back, his expression a mask of focus. Stay sharp. Valen won't let this ship go without a fight. As they pressed forward, the flickering lights above cast uneven shadows along the metallic walls. The tension grew heavier with each passing second, every creak and hiss of the ship amplifying the sense of danger. They reached an intersection, and Thomas raised a hand, signaling them to stop. Movement ahead, he murmured. Tony scanned his console, his augmented eyes glowing faintly as he overlaid thermal readings onto his display. Squad of 6. Standard patrol. They're converging on our position. Blaze smirked, checking his weapon. Guess we'll have to give them a warm welcome. No, Thomas said sharply. We avoid them. Save the fight for when it matters. Blaze frowned but nodded, falling into step as Thomas led them down a narrow maintenance shaft. The air was stifling, the walls closing in as they moved in near silence. The sound of footsteps and muffled voices above reminded them just how close the enemy was. They emerged in a storage bay, the dim lighting revealing rows of stacked crates marked with Empire insignias. Thomas signaled for a halt, scanning the area before motioning them forward. As Tony began setting another explosive charge on a nearby support beam, Blaze's eyes wandered to the markings on the crates. Bioweapons, he muttered, his voice tinged with disgust. So, this is what they've been hiding. Thomas didn't reply, his gaze fixed on the task at hand. The charge was armed, the timer ticking down as Tony stepped back. "Done," Tony said. "Let's move." But before they could, the sound of heavy boots filled the bay. A squad of soldiers entered from the far end, their weapons raised. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, the two groups locking eyes in mutual recognition. Then chaos erupted. Blaze was the first to fire, his rifle barking as the first soldier fell. Thomas moved like a shadow, his movements fluid and precise as he closed the distance to the nearest enemy, dispatching him with brutal efficiency. Tony ducked behind a crate, providing cover fire as the room descended into chaos. The firefight was fierce and unrelenting. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off metal surfaces, the air thick with the acrid stench of burning circuits and ozone. Blaze's sharp aim took down soldier after soldier, his every shot deliberate and deadly. Thomas wove through the fray, his focus unshakable as he fought with a ferocity that bordered on supernatural. But the Empire's soldiers were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. For every one they took down, two more seemed to appear. It was a brutal reminder of the odds they faced. "Thomas, we've got to fall back," Tony shouted, his voice barely audible over the din. "The charges are set. Let's not waste time." Blaze cursed under his breath, his frustration evident. "They just keep coming." Thomas nodded, his mind racing as he assessed their situation. "To the secondary route. Move." The team retreated, their movements coordinated and efficient. Blaze provided covering fire as Tony led the way, his console directing them through an alternate path. They reached a ventilation shaft, climbing through just as another explosion rocked the ship. The Empire's forces were momentarily disoriented, giving them the precious seconds they needed to escape. As they regrouped in a quieter section of the ship, the tension between them was palpable. Blaze's breathing was heavy, his hands gripping his weapon tightly. "This is madness," he said, his voice low but fierce. "We're barely holding them off. And Valen, he's nowhere to be found." Thomas met his gaze, his expression cold but resolute. "He's here, and we'll find him." Blaze shook his head, his frustration boiling over. "And if we don't, if this is all for nothing?" Thomas stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "It's not for nothing. We're here to send a message, to make them bleed for what they've done. Valen is just the start." The intensity in Thomas's voice silenced any further argument. Blaze nodded reluctantly, his anger giving way to determination. Tony watched the exchange in silence, his fingers still dancing over his console as he worked to keep their presence concealed. "We're not done yet," Tony said, breaking the tension. "The main reactor is 2 levels down. If we hit it, the Eclipse will be crippled." Thomas nodded. "Then we keep moving." As they descended deeper into the ship, the stakes grew higher. The corridors were tighter, the air colder, the sense of danger more oppressive. Every step brought them closer to their goal, and closer to the heart of the Empire's power. Finally, they reached the reactor chamber, its massive core pulsating with an eerie blue light. The room was heavily guarded, the soldiers' presence a testament to the importance of the target. Thomas signaled for silence, his mind racing as he devised a plan. "This is it," he whispered. "We hit the reactor and draw them in. Valen will come. He won't let the ship fall without a fight." Blaze smirked, his earlier frustration replaced by grim determination. "Then let's give him a fight." As they prepared for the final assault, Thomas allowed himself a brief moment to reflect. The path they were on was one of destruction, of sacrifice, but it was the only way forward. For Abigail, for humanity, for everything they had lost. And as the first shot rang out, the room erupting into chaos once more. Thomas knew there was no turning back. The reactor chamber descended into chaos as the first wave of soldiers stormed in, their weapons blazing. Thomas Whitaker moved like a shadow, weaving between cover and taking down enemies with ruthless efficiency. Every motion was calculated, his strikes precise, his mind consumed by a singular purpose: to end this, to bring Valen to justice for Abigail and every innocent soul crushed under the Empire's boot. Blaze Carter held his ground near the entrance, his rifle a blur of motion as he provided cover fire. His face was streaked with sweat and ash, but his aim never wavered. Beside him, Tony Harlow worked feverishly at the console, bypassing the reactor security protocols with an urgency that matched the chaos around him. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off the machinery, the room vibrating with the hum of raw energy and the roar of combat. "Thomas," Tony called out over the din, his voice strained. "I'm almost in. Just need a little more time." Time was a luxury they didn't have. More soldiers poured into the chamber, their relentless assault threatening to overwhelm the trio. Blaze shouted a warning as a grenade clattered to the floor near their position. Without hesitation, Thomas lunged forward, kicking the explosive back toward their attackers. It detonated midair, the shockwave sending bodies sprawling and filling the room with acrid smoke. "Focus, Tony," Thomas barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We need that core disabled now." Blaze cursed under his breath, reloading his weapon with practiced speed. "These guys just keep coming. It's like they know we're cornered." Thomas's jaw tightened, his eyes scanning the room. They were outnumbered but not outmatched. His mind raced through every possibility, every move they could make to turn the tide. And then he saw it. A control panel across the room, partially obscured by a tangle of pipes. If he could reach it, he could trigger a cascade that would force the soldiers to retreat or risk being consumed by the reactor's overload. "I'm going for the panel," Thomas said, his voice low and steady. "Cover me." Blaze glanced at him, his expression a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. "You're insane, you know that." Thomas's lips curled into a faint smirk. "Just keep them off me." Without waiting for a response, he sprinted across the open floor, his movements a blur of speed and precision. Blaze and Tony worked in tandem, laying down suppressing fire as Thomas darted between cover, every step bringing him closer to his goal. The soldiers seemed to realize his intent, their fire converging on him in a deadly hailstorm. He reached the panel and immediately set to work, his fingers flying over the controls. The heat from the reactor pulsed against his skin, the hum of energy growing louder with each passing second. He could feel the weight of every life depending on him, the ghosts of his past pushing him forward. Failure was not an option. "Core overload in 30 seconds, Tony called out, his voice tinged with both relief and urgency. "We need to move now." But Thomas wasn't finished. He keyed in a final sequence, his eyes narrowing as a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the chamber. Commander Tyrak Valen. The alien's towering frame exuded authority, his expression one of cold fury as he took in the scene. He barked an order, and the soldiers around him redoubled their efforts, their weapons blazing with renewed intensity. "Valen," Thomas muttered, his voice laced with venom. He turned away from the panel, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife strapped to his chest. "You're mine." The distance between them evaporated in an instant as Thomas charged, his movements a blur of lethal intent. Valen met him head-on, their clash reverberating through the chamber like a thunderclap. The alien's strength was immense, his blows heavy and relentless. But Thomas was faster, more precise. Every strike was a symphony of calculated violence, every counter a testament to his years of training. The fight was brutal, their bodies colliding with a force that shook the ground beneath them. Valen's blade slashed through the air, narrowly missing Thomas as he twisted away, his own knife plunging deep into the alien's side. Valen roared in pain, his massive hand lashing out and catching Thomas across the jaw, sending him sprawling. Your kind is weak, Valen snarled, blood dripping from his wound. You should have stayed in the shadows where you belong. Thomas wiped the blood from his lip, his eyes blazing with unyielding resolve. Weak, we endure, and that's what makes us unstoppable. With a guttural cry, he launched himself at Valen, their battle resuming with even greater ferocity. The seconds stretched into an eternity, the world narrowing to the brutal exchange of blows and the searing heat of the reactor behind them. Every strike, every movement was a dance of survival, each man determined to emerge victorious. Finally, Thomas saw his opening. Valen overextended, his massive frame faltering for a split second. It was all Thomas needed. He drove his knife upward, the blade piercing the alien's chest with a sickening crunch. Valen's eyes widened in shock, his breath hitching as he collapsed to his knees. Thomas leaned in close, his voice low and filled with quiet fury. This is for Abigail. With a final, twisting motion, he ended Valen's life. The alien's body slumped to the ground lifeless as the alarms reached a deafening crescendo. Thomas turned, his gaze finding Tony and Blaze, who were already making their way toward the exit. The charges are armed, Tony shouted. We've got 15 seconds to clear this place. Thomas didn't hesitate, his body moving on instinct as he sprinted after them. The corridors blurred around him, the sound of explosions and collapsing metal chasing them every step of the way. They reached the ship just as the Eclipse's reactor erupted in a blinding flash of light, the shockwave propelling them into the safety of space. As the battered vessel drifted away from the collapsing flagship, silence settled over the team. Tony slumped in his chair, his hands trembling as he powered down the console. Blaze leaned back against the wall, his chest heaving as he closed his eyes. Thomas stood at the viewport, his gaze fixed on the burning wreckage of the Eclipse. The glow of the explosion reflected in his eyes, a mix of grief and grim satisfaction etched into his features. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the locket that had been Abigail's. Holding it tightly, he whispered a vow to the void. For you, always. Then, Thomas Whitaker stood silently, his reflection staring back at him from the glass, fractured and faint against the black expanse. The remnants of the Eclipse were still visible, a slowly expanding field of debris glowing faintly with the heat of its destruction. Somewhere in that chaos lay the broken ambitions of the Galactic Empire, reduced to rubble in the wake of his vengeance. Behind him, Tony and Blaze spoke in hushed tones, their words indistinct but heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The room carried a solemn stillness, the kind that only followed survival against impossible odds. The hum of the ship's engines was the only constant, a quiet reminder that they had escaped with their lives, though not entirely unscathed. Tony eventually broke the silence, stepping closer to Thomas. "It's done," he said softly, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic gentleness. "Valen's gone. The Eclipse is gone. You did what you came to do." Thomas didn't respond immediately, his fingers absently tracing the edges of Abigail's locket. The warmth of the ship's interior felt foreign, almost unwelcome against the icy chill that had settled in his chest. "Did I?" he finally asked, his voice low and distant. Tony frowned. "You avenged her. You sent a message to the Empire they won't forget. That counts for something." Blaze scoffed from his seat in the corner, the sharpness of his tone cutting through the room. "Yeah, but what now? You think they'll just roll over and beg for mercy? This isn't the end, Whitaker. Not by a long shot." Thomas turned, his gaze locking onto Blaze's. There was no anger in his expression, no rebuttal, only a quiet, steely resolve. "I know it's not the end. It never was." Blaze leaned forward, his scarred hands resting on his knees. "So what's next? You gonna keep playing the one-man army, taking down every Empire lackey you can find? Or are you finally gonna let someone else help carry the weight?" Tony raised an eyebrow, looking between the two men. "He's got a point, Thomas. We've got momentum now, but it's not enough. If we're going to stand a chance against what's coming, We need more than just the three of us. Thomas closed his hand around the locket, his grip tightening as he considered their words. He had fought alone for so long, relying on his own strength, his own anger. But this wasn't just his fight anymore. It was humanity's fight, and it would take more than vengeance to win it. He looked at Tony and Blaze, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that was impossible to ignore. Then we build. We find those willing to stand, those who've suffered like we have. This isn't just about revenge. It's about survival. Blaze grinned faintly, his usual bravado returning. Guess we've got work to do. Thomas turned back to the viewport, his reflection fading into the infinite stars. We're just getting started.